On the 15th of May, 1911, Chief Justice Edward White rose from his bench in the marble chamber of the Supreme Court of the United States and read aloud, for the better part of 2 hours, an opinion that ran to more than 20,000 words. The defendant in the case before him was a corporation. Its name had become by then a kind of incantation in American life. Standard Oil. It was the most efficient industrial enterprise the country had yet produced. It was also, the court ruled, an unlawful conspiracy and restraint of trade to be dissolved into 34 separate companies within 6 months. In a quiet sitting room at Pocantico Hills, north of New York City, a man of 71 received the news with little visible expression. He had been expecting it for nearly a decade. He was the wealthiest American who had ever lived, and the most hated. His name was John Davison Rockefeller. He had built the trust brick by patient brick, beginning in a Cleveland refinery on the banks of the Cuyahoga River when the Civil War was still being fought. He had crushed his competitors with a precision that men in those years described as biblical. And he had done so in his own private accounting, in the service of order. This is the story of how the most thorough monopoly in American history was assembled, what it did to the country that built it, and the shadow it casts upon the land still. He was born on a hardscrabble farm in the village of Richford, New York, on the 8th of July, 1839, the second of 6 children. The country was still raw then. The railroad had not yet reached the Susquehanna Valley. The forests above the Owego Creek were dense and full of game. Into this place came a boy who would, before he was 60 years old, control the kerosene that lit the lamps of 3/4 of the American Republic and the oil that moved through every pipeline in the eastern United States. The Rockefellers were poor in the manner of upstate New York farmers in those years, which is to say, they were land-rich and cash-poor. The boy's mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, was a woman of unsmiling Baptist conviction. She kept a tidy kitchen, mended her own dresses, and held her children to a ledger of small economies. "Willful waste," she would say, "makes woeful want." The phrase fixed itself in her son's mind for the rest of his long life. So did her habit of tithing. By the age of 7, the boy was setting aside a portion of every coin he earned for the Baptist church in a small blue book that he kept on a shelf above his bed. His father was a different sort of man entirely. William Avery Rockefeller, known throughout the back roads of the Finger Lakes as Big Bill, was a peddler of patent medicines, a horse trader, and, when occasion required, a confidence man. He traveled long circuits through the towns of central New York and northern Pennsylvania, selling bottled cures for cancer, deafness, and rheumatism, charging $25 a treatment in towns where a workman might earn $1 a day. He carried on a string around his neck a buckskin pouch full of silver coins that he liked to spill across the kitchen table when he came home, to the alarm of his wife and the awe of his children. In time, William Avery Rockefeller would call himself Dr. William Livingston and keep a second household with a second wife in Canada and later in Illinois. He would not be discovered until long after his death. He returned to Richford only intermittently, leaving the running of the farm to Eliza and the older boys. When he did appear, he taught his sons to bargain hard and to trust no one in matters of money, including, he sometimes said with a tight smile, himself. "I cheat my boys every time I get a chance," he was known to say. "I want to make 'em sharp." The contrast between the two parents shaped the child more than any school did. From his mother, John Davison Rockefeller learned that wealth was a stewardship accountable to God, and that no penny was too small to count. From his father, he learned that the world contained predators, that commerce was a contest of wits, and that the man who failed to count his pennies would in time be devoured by men who counted theirs. From both, he absorbed the habit, unusual in a child, of keeping a written record of every transaction he made. He was an unusually grave boy. He sang hymns in a clear voice, was prized at the Baptist Sunday School, and rose, even in winter, before dawn. By the age of 12, he had raised a flock of turkeys, sold them in the autumn for a profit, and lent the proceeds at 7% interest to a neighboring farmer. The transaction was recorded with the date, the principal, and the rate in a small notebook he carried in his coat. When the loan was repaid the following spring, he set the figure down in another column and noted the difference. The first profit he ever earned by interest was, he would later recall, a more vivid pleasure than the first profit he ever earned by labor. He never afterward forgot the lesson. In the autumn of 1853, when the boy was 14, the family moved west. Big Bill, by then increasingly absent, had decided that the future lay in Ohio. After 2 years of moving between rented houses, the family settled at last in a small frame house in the village of Strongsville on the rolling Cleveland Plain. Cleveland in those years was a city in transformation. The Erie Canal had ended at Buffalo, but the new railroads now stitched the lake ports to the coal fields of Pennsylvania, and the city's population had quadrupled in a decade. Forwarding houses lined the Cuyahoga River. Schooners and propellers crowded the harbor at the mouth of the Cuyahoga. The acrid smell of ironworks and tannery already drifted over the bluffs above the river. The boy attended Cleveland's Central High School for 2 years, then enrolled in a 10-week bookkeeping course at Folsom's Mercantile College on Public Square. He was an indifferent student in most subjects, but a meticulous one in arithmetic. He could read a column of figures the way another boy reads a poem. By his own later account, the prospect of mastering double-entry accounts struck him with the force of vocation. On the 26th of September, 1855, at the age of 16, he walked into the small commission house of Hewitt and Tuttle, on the second floor of a brick building at the corner of Merwin and River Streets, and was hired as an assistant bookkeeper. His pay was $3.50 a week, raised after 3 months to $4. He worked from before sunrise until late in the evening, 6 days out of 7, and gave the appearance, even to his employers, of a young man older than his years. He never afterward forgot the date he had begun. He referred to it for the rest of his life as Job Day, and celebrated it each year in private with the formality of a saint's feast. It was at Hewitt and Tuttle that the habit of the ledger took root in him. He kept a personal account book, which he called Ledger A, in which he recorded every penny he earned and every penny he spent. The book is preserved still in the archives of the Rockefeller family. The hand is precise, the columns are aligned, the entries are unromantic. 2 cents for a postage stamp, 10 cents for a missionary collection, 50 cents to his mother, $1.50 for a pair of gloves. He paid his board, set aside his tithe, and watched the small balance grow. The discipline of the ledger reflected his precision. He took also to auditing the firm's freight bills with an attention that was almost theological. He believed, the way some men believe in providence, that the railroads cheated their customers wherever the customer permitted it. He once spent the better part of a week running down a charge of $1.20 that he was certain a freight clerk had assessed in error. He recovered the $1.20. He never forgot it. His focus on auditing showed a deep sense of providence. When the war came, in the spring of 1861, he was 21 years old and had just gone into business for himself. 2 years earlier, he had borrowed $1,000 from his father at 10% interest and had taken a young Englishman named Maurice Clark as a partner. The firm of Clark and Rockefeller, Produce commission merchants, occupied a small office on River Street and dealt in grain, salt pork, hay, and whatever else moved by canal and rail through the warehouses of Cleveland. The choices he made during the war highlighted the ambition of Clark. Like a great many of the most successful businessmen of his generation, John Davison Rockefeller did not enlist in the Union Army. He paid the legal $300 to a substitute and remained at his desk. The decision was, on the surface, unsentimental. He had a widowed mother to support, for his father had by now vanished into the West, and his 3 younger siblings were too small to manage a household. But there was, in the choice, also an early glimpse of the man who would emerge. His stance reflected his Union values. He understood that the war was not only a moral cataclysm, it was also a market. The Union Army required food, salt, blankets, hardware, and, increasingly, a clean-burning fuel for its lamps. The price of every commodity in Cleveland rose. Clark and Rockefeller prospered. By the end of the first full year of the war, the firm had cleared $17,000 in profit, a sum that in the currency of the period would have built a substantial brick house on Euclid Avenue and furnished it. This success underscored the enormous profit and the emerging market. In the summer of 1859, in a wooded valley of northwestern Pennsylvania, a man called Edwin Drake, hired by a New Haven banker, had drilled the first commercial oil well in the history of the world. The town of Titusville, on Oil Creek, transformed within months into a delirium of derricks. Crude petroleum, the dark and pungent liquid that bubbled up from the Devonian sandstone of the Allegheny Plateau, was for the moment chiefly useful as the source of a fluid called kerosene, which, when refined, burned in lamps with a steadier and cleaner flame than whale oil and at a fraction of the cost. The lamps of America were about to change. So were its nights. The discovery of oil sparked a new era for the lamp. The crude itself moved out of the Pennsylvania hills in oak barrels, lashed to flat cars on the New Atlantic and Great Western Railway, bound for the refining centers of the East. Cleveland, by the accident of geography, sat at a crosspoint. The Atlantic and Great Western ran straight to it. The lake offered cheap transport in the open seasons. The coal of southern Ohio was nearby for fuel. The skilled coopers of the city could supply barrels by the tens of thousands. Within 3 years of Drake's well, Cleveland had become one of the great refining hubs of the continent, with 20-some refineries stretched along the marshy bottomlands of Kingsbury Run and the lower Cuyahoga. In 1863, Maurice Clark's brother Samuel persuaded his partners to take a side interest in a small refinery being put up by an English chemist named Samuel Andrews on a piece of swampy ground beside Kingsbury Run, 2 miles south of the river. Andrews knew the chemistry of refining. He understood how to drive off the lighter and heavier fractions of crude petroleum and capture the kerosene cleanly in the middle. The Clarks and Rockefeller put up the capital. The little firm was christened somewhat grandly the Excelsior Works. It would prove to be the seed of an empire. For 2 years, Rockefeller divided his attention between the produce house and the refinery. He kept the books of both. He walked the half-mile from his lodgings on Cheshire Street to the refinery before dawn, watching the stills come to heat, watching the kerosene drip into the test tubes, asking the foreman why one barrel cost 6 cents more than another. He was, in those years, already what he would always be. He was the man who measured. He was the man who counted. The partnership with the Clarks soon strained. Maurice Clark was a cautious and conventional man. He distrusted the volatility of the oil business, which had already produced and ruined a dozen small fortunes in the Pennsylvania fields, and he wished to keep the produce house as the firm's main concern. Rockefeller, who had walked the refining floor and read the ledgers, believed the opposite. By the winter of 1865, the disagreement was open. The two men quarreled almost daily. At length, in the office of the firm's lawyer in Cleveland on the 2nd of February of that year, the partners agreed that one of them should buy the other out, and that the matter should be settled by a private auction between them that very afternoon. The auction is one of the small set pieces of American business history. It was conducted by the lawyer George H. Burwell. The bidding began at $500. It rose, in slow increments, through the morning and into the afternoon in the stove-warmed back room, while the snow fell outside upon Superior Street. The Clarks, at last, bid $72,000. Rockefeller, who had quietly arranged a line of credit at the Cleveland banks the week before, bid $72,500. Maurice Clark put down his pencil. The refinery on Kingsbury Run was Rockefeller's. He was 25 years old. The check he wrote that February afternoon would be, in the currency of the present day, something on the order of $1.5 million. He had never had so much money at risk in his life. He had also never been more certain. He walked out of the lawyer's office, past the snow piled along Superior Street, and back to the refinery on the run. The Excelsior Works was now Rockefeller and Andrews. The next morning's Cleveland Leader announced the change in a small notice on the 3rd page. By the end of the year, it was the largest refinery in Cleveland. He had begun. The refinery at Kingsbury Run grew through the spring and summer that followed the auction. By the close of the year 1865, Rockefeller and Andrews was producing 500 barrels of refined kerosene a day, twice the output of any of its Cleveland rivals, and clearing more profit in a single week than the produce house on River Street had cleared in a season. Within 2 years, Rockefeller had bought out his last commission business partners and committed himself entirely to the oil trade. He was 28 years old. He moved his lodgings to a more substantial house on Cheshire Street, hired a coachman, and began to attend the Erie Street Baptist Church each Sunday morning where, in the presence of his wife, Laura Spellman Rockefeller, and a growing circle of Cleveland's commercial men, he sang the hymns in a voice that was admired for its clarity and steadiness. He was also, by the end of 1867, in partnership with the man who would become his most consequential associate. Henry Morrison Flagler was 37, an Ohio salt merchant who had failed in the salt panic of 1863 and had clawed his way back through grain and whiskey commissions. Flagler was urbane where Rockefeller was austere, gregarious where his partner was reserved, and possessed of a legal mind so precise that the firm soon delegated to him the drafting of every important contract. He kept on the wall of his office at the Cleveland Atlantic Bank building a motto, hand-lettered in Gothic script. "Do unto others as they would do unto you," the motto read, "and do it first." It was meant by Flagler himself as a joke. It was repeated in the years to come as a creed. The firm was reorganized as Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler in 1867. On the 10th of January, 1870, after a further round of consolidations of Cleveland properties, it was incorporated under Ohio law as the Standard Oil Company. The capitalization was $1 million in shares. Rockefeller held a quarter of them. Flagler held a similar portion. Andrews, the chemist, somewhat less. The first share certificate, signed in Rockefeller's careful hand, is among the prized exhibits of the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland today. The man who signed it was 30 years old. He was the principal of one of the largest single industrial concerns in the United States. But the industry into which Standard Oil now expanded was a wreckage. The end of the Civil War had loosed an avalanche of new refineries upon the country. By 1870, the city of Pittsburgh held 48 of them, Philadelphia 22, the Pennsylvania oil regions another 30, and Cleveland alone 26. The total reefing capacity of the United States was estimated by one trade journal of that year at 3 times the visible demand. The price of refined kerosene, which had stood at 60 cents a gallon at the close of the war, had collapsed to 26 cents. Many of the smaller works were operating at a loss. Some were operating, as men in Cleveland said, at the loss of their souls. Refiners pawned their wives' jewelry to keep their stills lit. Wagon loads of unsold kerosene stood for weeks on the sidings at Whiskey Island. The Cleveland Leader, in a sober editorial of January 1870, wondered aloud whether any orderly future was possible in a trade so given to its own destruction. Rockefeller diagnosed the disease without sentiment. The industry was suffering from too much competition, which is to say, from competition itself. The remedy was order, and the only order he could imagine was a single combination, controlled by the strongest hand, that would discipline production, fix prices, and absorb every refiner of consequence in the country. He used a particular word for the project. He called it, in his correspondence and in his board meetings, our plan. The instrument by which the plan first moved was the railroad. By 1870, the 3 great trunk lines that crossed the Alleghanies had become themselves a study in ruinous competition. The Pennsylvania Railroad, under its president Thomas Alexander Scott, had been at war for years with the Erie, controlled by the specifier Jay Gould, and with the New York Central, controlled by the Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. The 3 roads carried the bulk of the country's oil traffic eastward to the seaboard refineries and to the export docks at Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New York Harbor. They competed by cutting their freight rates against one another, sometimes to the point of hauling oil at less than the cost of the coal that fueled the locomotive. They were, all 3, on the edge of receivership. The convergence of interests was clear to any man who could read a freight schedule. The railroads needed steady, large-volume shipments at fair rates. The largest refiner in the country needed a way to crush every refiner smaller than himself. Each could provide what the other lacked. The vehicle they devised was a dormant Pennsylvania corporation called the South Improvement Company. The charter had been issued some years earlier for a different purpose entirely, and had been allowed to lapse on the books of the Commonwealth. Tom Scott's Circle purchased and revived it in the spring of 1871. Through the long autumn of that year, in a series of meetings held in the private parlors of the Continental Hotel in Philadelphia and the St. Nicholas Hotel in New York, the contours of an agreement were drawn. The principals at the table were Scott of the Pennsylvania, William H. Vanderbilt for the New York Central, James Fisk, and Jay Gould for the Erie, and on behalf of a small consortium of refiners that he had quietly assembled around the figure of Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller. The signatures upon the final contracts were affixed in January of 1872. The mechanism was elegant in the manner of a poisoned blade. The official freight rate per barrel of refined oil from Cleveland to New York was fixed at $2. Standard Oil and a small number of allied refiners would be charged the official rate, but would receive, within 30 days of each shipment, a rebate of $1 a barrel paid quietly out of the railroad's books. So far, this was nothing the trade had not seen before. Large shippers everywhere extracted rebates from railroads. The Vanderbilt rate card had been, by general understanding, a polite fiction since the 1850s. What was new, and what was to be the permanent stain upon the South Improvement contracts, was the second clause. Refiners outside the South Improvement Circle would also be charged $2 a barrel. But for every barrel those independent refiners shipped, the railroad would pay an additional drawback of 40 cents directly to Standard Oil. In the operation of the system, every Pittsburgh independent who consigned a tank car of kerosene to the docks of New York was, without his knowledge, paying tribute to his largest competitor in Cleveland. The railroads furnished Standard Oil, by the further terms of the agreement, with monthly statements of every rival shipment, that the drawbacks might be properly tallied. There has rarely been a more thorough instrument of commercial destruction proposed in writing. Armed with the contracts, Rockefeller and Flagler returned to Cleveland in the third week of February 1872 and began a series of visits. The first to be approached was Alexander, Schofield and Company, an old and respected refining firm on Whiskey Island. Its principal, John Henry Alexander, received Rockefeller and Flagler in the parlor of his home on St. Clair Street and listened in mounting astonishment as the terms of the South Improvement contracts were laid out before him. The choice, his visitors explained, was a plain one. He could sell his refinery to Standard Oil at an appraised value, accepting payment in cash or in Standard Oil stock at par, or he could decline and watch his freight bills crush him within 90 days. Rockefeller, by Alexander's own later account, made the case in language as quiet as a man speaking of weather. "I have ways of making money," he is reported to have said, "that you know nothing about." Alexander hesitated, sought confirmation with the freight agents at the Atlantic and Great Western Depot, found the rumors to be exact, and within a week sold his works to Standard Oil for $65,000 in cash, a fraction of what he had built the firm to be worth. He spent the rest of his life regretting that he had not taken stock. Many years later, in a deposition for the federal government, he described the interview in the parlor of his home as the moment in which he had understood for the first time that the country he lived in had changed. The visits continued day after day through the closing weeks of February and the opening weeks of March, 1872. Rockefeller called personally upon some of the principals. Flagler called upon others. A junior associate, Oliver Burr Jennings, called upon a third group. The terms varied at the margin, the substance did not. Each refiner was shown a copy of the South Improvement freight schedule and was offered a choice between sale and ruin. Of the 26 refineries operating in Cleveland at the start of the year, 22 had been visited, valued, and absorbed by Standard Oil before the spring thaw. The newspapers later called the episode the Cleveland Massacre, though no blood had been shed and no firm had been formally compelled. Each had walked in the end into the Standard Oil offices on Euclid Avenue and signed the papers of its own dissolution. They had simply been shown a future they could not survive. A few held out, briefly. Hanna, Baslington and Company, partly owned by Robert Hanna, the elder brother of the future Ohio Senator Marcus Alonzo Hanna, refused the first offer and was absorbed some weeks later on terms still less favorable than those the firm had originally rejected. Clark, Payne and Company, the firm of the Yale-educated refiner Oliver Hazard Payne, sold for $400,000 in Standard Oil stock, becoming, in the moment of his surrender, an immensely wealthy man and a Standard Oil director for the rest of his life. The lesson was carefully observed by every refiner in the country. Resistance was costly. Capitulation, on the right terms, was a path into the inner circle. The South Improvement contracts, however, had been a secret only so long as their architects had been able to keep the freight clerks of 3 railroads silent. They were not. In the second week of March, 1872, A copy of the new freight schedule bearing the rebates and drawbacks in plain script fell into the hands of an oil producer in Titusville. Within 48 hours, the contents had been telegraphed to the New York Tribune, which printed them in full on the morning of the 18th. The oil regions of Pennsylvania erupted. Mass meetings were called in rapid succession in Titusville, Oil City, Franklin, and Petroleum Center. 3,000 torches lit the streets of Titusville on the night of the 25th of March, in a procession of producers and teamsters that wound from the depot on Spring Street to the offices of the Petroleum Producers Union. Effigies of Tom Scott and of Rockefeller, identified upon their breasts in white paint, were set alight at the corner of Diamond and Franklin Streets and burned to ash before the windows of the operatives' boarding houses. The Petroleum Producers Union, formed within a fortnight of the Tribune's exposure, declared an embargo upon all crude shipments to any refinery party to the South Improvement Scheme. 3,000 wells in the Pennsylvania fields were shut in. The boycott held for 40 days. The Cleveland refineries that Rockefeller had so recently absorbed sat idle for want of crude. The Pittsburgh refiners, who had escaped absorption by the accident of geography, sent committees to confer with the producers meeting at Oil City. The Pittsburgh Commercial, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the New York World ran the South Improvement contracts in full upon their front pages and called for the impeachment of any state legislator who had voted to grant the original charter. Under the pressure of the producers' embargo and the indignation of the Pennsylvania press, the state legislature in Harrisburg revoked the charter of the South Improvement Company on the 2nd of April, 1872, less than 90 days after its agreements had been signed. The Pennsylvania, the Erie, and the New York Central, in a joint statement issued from the offices of Tom Scott in Philadelphia 3 days later, abandoned the rebate and drawback structure and declared that all shippers of refined oil would thenceforth be charged the same rates upon equal terms. The South Improvement Company itself, in its formal capacity, had transacted no commercial business at any point in its short and infamous life. It had been the bridge across which the real consolidation walked. By the time the charter was repealed, Rockefeller already controlled 4/5 of the refining capacity of Cleveland and almost a quarter of the refining capacity of the United States. The instrument by which he had achieved it was now ash. The achievement was permanent. He was 32 years old. He had also, in the operation of those 45 days, learned the lesson that would shape the next 4 decades of his work. The South Improvement Company had failed because its scheme had been written down, and what was written down could be leaked, and what was leaked could be undone by the outcry of producers and the indignation of legislatures. The next combination, and the one after that, would not depend upon any contract that a freight clerk could carry to a newspaper. It would depend upon ownership, vertical and total. Pittsburgh would fall first, then the Allegheny pipelines, then the great refineries of the New Jersey shore that fed the export wharves of New York Harbor, then the export trade itself, from the docks of Bayonne to the lamp-lit parlors of Hamburg and Shanghai. The trust, in the form the country would come to know and to hate, had not yet been built. But the man who would build it had now seen, in the mirror of the Cleveland massacre, the precise reflection of his own method. For the 2 years that followed the rescission of the South Improvement Charter, the oil regions of Pennsylvania entered a period of uneasy peace. The producers, having broken the railroad's rate and drawback scheme by the force of their boycott, returned to their wells in the spring of 1872 with the conviction that the worst had been faced down. They had been mistaken in nearly every particular. The South Improvement Company had been the mechanism. The man who had stood behind it was untouched. He had walked out of the wreckage of the scheme with control of 4/5 of Cleveland's refining capacity in his hand. He now turned his attention east. In the autumn of 1872, John Davison Rockefeller met privately at the Bingham House in Philadelphia with Charles Lockhart, the leading refiner of Pittsburgh, and with William Green Worden of the firm of Worden, Frew and Company. The meetings were unhurried and oblique. The men had been business correspondents for years. They knew one another's books. By the close of the third interview, in October of that year, both Lockhart and Worden had agreed to exchange the stock of their refineries for stock in Standard Oil at terms that left them, in title, the principals of the absorbed concerns and, in fact, lieutenants of the man in Cleveland. The agreement was kept secret for almost 2 years. Lockhart continued to attend the meetings of the Pittsburgh Refiners Association as if independent, voting at every session against the encroachments of Standard Oil. He was, by the spring of 1874, in the curious position of opposing himself. The pattern repeated itself across the trade. Jacob J. Vandergrift, the former steamboat captain who controlled the largest refinery on the Allegheny River, was absorbed in the autumn of 1873. John Dustin Archbold, only 30 years old, the former secretary of the Petroleum Producers Union, and the man who had publicly burned Rockefeller in effigy at Titusville 14 months earlier, was absorbed in the spring of 1875. Archbold's price was particularly bitter to the men who had stood with him at the producers' meetings. He sold his Acme Oil Works for stock in Standard Oil and a place upon the executive committee. Within a decade, he would be the second most powerful man in the trust, and within 40 years, he would die its president. In March of 1875, in a private meeting at Saratoga Springs, the senior officers of the absorbed houses executed an instrument that was called, by the lawyer Samuel Calvin Tate Dodd, the Pittsburgh Plan, and by the trade, when its existence at last became known, the Central Association. Each refiner assigned the stock of his concern to a body of trustees. The trustees were, in every case, the senior officers of Standard Oil. The arrangement was, on its face, an ordinary refining trade compact. In substance, it was a unified holding of capital that no single state's law had been written to address. By the close of 1875, the Central Association controlled, by direct ownership or by allied agreement, 90% of the refining capacity of the United States. The country had not yet been told. The remaining battles of the 1870s were fought, not over refining, but over transportation. The man who had given Rockefeller his first lesson in railroad combination, Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania, had by now also seen the lesson of the Cleveland massacre. He had built a freight subsidiary of the Pennsylvania called the Empire Transportation Company under the management of a Philadelphian named Joseph Dilworth Potts, and through the early 1870s, the Empire had quietly bought up pipelines in the oil regions, refineries in New York Harbor, and a fleet of tank cars that ran upon the Pennsylvania Railroad's rails by special arrangement. Potts intended, in time, to be Rockefeller's equal in the Eastern trade. The intention had not escaped its object. In March of 1877, after a year of preliminary maneuvering, Standard Oil declared a freight war upon the Pennsylvania. The Erie and the New York Central, by prearrangement, sided with Rockefeller. The price of refined oil shipped to the seaboard fell, within 90 days, to a level at which only one shipper in the trade could be supplied at a profit, and that shipper was Standard Oil. The Pennsylvania, weakened further by the great railroad strikes that swept Pittsburgh and Baltimore in July of that year, sued for terms in September. On the 17th of October, 1877, in a meeting held at the Standard Oil offices on Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan, the Pennsylvania Railroad sold the Empire Transportation Company to Standard Oil for $3.4 million in cash, the largest single commercial transaction so far recorded in the United States. Tom Scott, the man who had ridden out of the Civil War as the Union's railroad quartermaster, walked out of the meeting with the price of his pipelines and the understanding, complete and bitter, that he had taught his pupil too well. What followed was the construction by Daniel O'Day of a pipeline empire under the Standard Oil flag. O'Day, an Irish immigrant who had begun his working life as a teamster on Oil Creek and who possessed a memory for terrain that engineers said was a kind of second sight, organized the absorbed Empire pipelines, the Vandergrift lines, the Standard's own newer trunks, and a dozen smaller systems into a single network that he called the United Pipelines. By the close of 1878, United Pipelines transported 9 of every 10 barrels of crude that left the Pennsylvania fields. The producers of the oil regions, who had supposed in 1872 that they had broken the trust, found themselves shipping their crude at rates fixed by Standard Oil pipelines to refineries owned by Standard Oil in tank cars allotted at the discretion of Standard Oil's freight clerks. The broken piece had become, in 6 years, a closed circle. Out of this closed circle, in the winter of 1878, came one last and remarkable act of resistance. A combine of independent producers in the Bradford field of northwestern Pennsylvania, led by Byron David Benson, Robert E. Hopkins, and David McKelvey, conceived a project that the engineers of the day pronounced impossible. They proposed to build a long-distance pipeline that would carry crude oil under high pressure from the Pennsylvania fields directly to the seaboard over the ridges of the Allegheny Mountains, bypassing the railroads and Standard Oil's own pipelines entirely. The proposal, when it was published in the trade journals of January 1879, was met with a near-universal verdict that crude oil could not be pumped over a mountain. Benson, Hopkins, and McKelvey commissioned an engineer named Herman Haupt, the same Herman Haupt who had built the United States Military Railroad for the Union Army in the Virginia campaigns, to design the pumping stations. They acquired a continuous strip of right-of-way from Corryville, Pennsylvania, eastward to Williamsport, by the device of buying farmsteads in plain sale rather than rights-of-way in negotiation, frustrating Standard Oil's known practice of paying landowners along projected routes to refuse passage. They laid 109 miles of 6-inch wrought-iron pipe through Cuyahoga and Lycoming counties, with 3 pumping stations along its length in the spring of 1879. On the 28th of May, 1879, the first crude oil moved through the Tidewater pipeline at a pressure no engineer in the country had previously believed sustainable. The pumps ran, the pipe held, the oil arrived at Williamsport on schedule. The producers of the Bradford field had built, against the unanimous advice of the trade, the first long-distance crude pipeline in the history of the world. The act of construction was a triumph. The act of survival was less so. Standard Oil, having determined within a year that the Tidewater could not be defeated by competition, set about defeating it by acquisition. By the close of 1883, Rockefeller and Henry Huddleston Rogers had, by the patient purchase of stock, through intermediaries and the seating of allied directors, obtained a controlling interest in the Tidewater Pipeline Company. The first long-distance pipeline in the world had become, within 4 years of its construction, a Standard Oil subsidiary. The men who built it remained, in title, its officers. The dividends went, by a longer route, to 26 Broadway. By that year, The building at 26 Broadway in Lower Manhattan had become the headquarters of the trust, in fact, if not yet in formal address. Rockefeller himself had moved his family from Euclid Avenue in Cleveland to a brownstone on West 54th Street in Manhattan in the spring of 1884. The executive committee met in the Standard Oil offices on Lower Broadway each weekday morning at 9. The men who sat around the long oak table in that office were the largest single industrial concentration of capital that had so far been gathered in the United States, and quite possibly in the world. They had no formal name for what they were. The corporations of 14 separate states held the legal shells of their operations. The trust agreement that would describe their actual unity had not yet been written. The lawyer who would write it had been at his desk in the Standard Oil offices for nearly 3 years. His name was Samuel Calvin Tate Dodd. He was the son of an oil region grocer, a former counsel to the Petroleum Producers Union, and the most original mind in American corporate law in the second half of the 19th century. He had been hired by Standard Oil in 1879 as general counsel. He had a horror of monopoly that did not extend to the work of designing one. Through the years 1880 and 1881, Dodd considered the legal problem before him with a thoroughness that has since been studied as a feat of legal architecture in itself. The combination he was being asked to formalize was unlawful by the terms of nearly every state corporation statute then in force, in nearly every state in which Standard Oil operated. His task was to render it lawful by a structural innovation that no statute had so far contemplated. The instrument he produced was the trust agreement, executed in the offices of Standard Oil at 44 Broadway on the 2nd of January, 1882. The agreement bound 41 shareholders who together held all of the stock of 40 separate Standard Oil-affiliated companies in 14 states. Each shareholder assigned the entirety of his stock to a body of 9 trustees who would hold the assigned stock in trust and would issue, in exchange, certificates of trust interest. The 9 trustees were John Davison Rockefeller, his brother William Rockefeller, Henry Morrison Flagler, Oliver Hazard Payne, Jabez Abel Bostwick, John Dustin Archbold, Charles Pratt, William Green Warden, and Benjamin Brewster. The total capital represented by the certificates was $70 million. The legal effect was that no shareholder henceforth controlled the operations of the company in which he held an interest. The trustees alone did. The trustees, in their decisions, were answerable to no court of any single state, because no single state's law had jurisdiction over an instrument of this novel kind. The agreement was not registered with any public authority. It was kept in a single signed copy in a vault at 26 Broadway. Its existence would not be confirmed by Standard Oil under oath until 1888. By the time the country learned how it had been governed in this manner for 6 years. What had been built by the 2nd of January, 1882, was the most thorough commercial combination yet assembled upon the American continent. It controlled 90% of the refining of the United States, 90% of the long-distance pipelines, the larger portion of the tank car fleet, the dominant share of the export trade through the harbors of New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, and a permanent seat at the negotiating table of every railroad east of the Mississippi River. Its name was now, by accident of geography and by the deliberate vagueness of its founders, Standard Oil, though the corporate entity by that name in any single state held only a fraction of its actual operations. The country did not yet have a name for the form. The country would coin one. The word the country would settle upon, with the bewilderment of a republic that had not previously had to describe such a thing, was trust. The word came slowly into common American use. In the trade press of 1883 and 1884, it was still rendered with apologetic quotation marks, as if the editors of Bradstreet's and the Oil, Paint, and Drug Reporter were not yet confident that their readers would know what they meant by it. By the close of the decade, the quotation marks had fallen away. The word had passed into the vocabulary of editorial writers, of stump orators, of farmers who had never set foot in a refinery, and of legislators in 20 state capitals. Trust. The Whiskey Trust. The Sugar Trust. The Cottonseed Oil Trust. The Lead Trust. They had been formed in conscious imitation of the original. And the original, by the close of 1885, refined 85% of the petroleum produced in the United States, controlled the larger share of the country's pipeline mileage, and shipped from the docks of Bayonne and Constable Hook in New Jersey the kerosene that lit nearly every lamp east of the Urals and west of the China Sea. The lamps mattered. They had to be understood as the foundation upon which everything else stood. In the year 1885, the kerosene lamp was the most widely owned article of industrial manufacture in the world. Electric light, in its earliest commercial form, had been demonstrated by Thomas Alva Edison at his laboratory in Menlo Park only 6 years earlier, and would not reach the parlors of the American middle class for 2 decades after that. Gas illumination served the streets of major cities and the houses of the wealthy. The remainder of the lit world, from the cottages of Lancashire to the trading posts of the Orinoco and the merchant houses of Yokohama, depended upon kerosene. And nearly 9 in every 10 gallons of that kerosene in the markets of Europe, Asia, and Latin America in the middle 1880s came from a single corporation in Lower Manhattan, whose name was not printed upon the tin in which the kerosene was sold. The tins themselves were a study in the trust's reach. They were of 2 standard sizes, 5 gallons and 10, of a uniform tin plate manufactured by the Standard Oil subsidiary at Bayonne, soldered by hand by women working in the company's tinning shops at piece rates, packed in pine cases of the trust's own milling, lashed to the decks of the trust's own tank steamers, the Gluikoff and her sister vessels, and unloaded at the trust's own depots in Hamburg, Antwerp, Singapore, Bombay, Calcutta, and Yokohama. The brand name varied by market. Pratt's Astral Oil in the East Indies, Devoe's Brilliant in the Levant, Upion in parts of southern Europe, Standard White in the American interior. The kerosene inside was identical. The brand name was a courtesy to the local distributor and a screen against the public knowledge of how thoroughly one company controlled what burned in the world's lamps after dark. The volumes were hard to grasp. By the year 1890, Standard Oil's exports to Europe alone exceeded 450 million gallons annually. The trust's revenues that year approached $150 million. Its accumulated surplus, retained in the corporate treasury rather than distributed to shareholders, was greater than the working capital of every bank in the city of New York combined. Its dividends to the holders of trust certificates ran to 20% of par per year, in good years and bad, paid quarterly with the regularity of a tide. The decisions that drove these volumes were made every weekday morning at 9 o'clock in a single oak-paneled room on the 9th floor of the Standard Oil Building at 26 Broadway by a body of men who called themselves simply the Executive Committee. The committee numbered 9. Its membership shifted at the margin across the years, but at its center in the middle 1880s sat John Davison Rockefeller as president, Henry Morrison Flagler as the master of contracts and counsel, William Rockefeller in charge of the export trade and the New York banking relationships, Henry Huddleston Rogers in charge of natural gas and the Western pipelines, John Dustin Archbold as the rising operational man and the eventual heir, and the lawyer, Samuel Dodd. who attended without vote. The committee took up on each morning's agenda every operational question of consequence in the trust's far-reaching apparatus. The price at which kerosene would be sold in the eastern markets of the United States that week. The freight rate to be demanded of the New York Central for the coming month. The accommodation to be offered or refused to a small refiner in Marietta, Ohio, who had appealed to the trust for a peace. The terms upon which the Tidewater dividend would be declared. The reply to be sent to the senator in Washington who had requested an interview. The deliberations were unrecorded. Minutes were taken by no clerk. Decisions were communicated by letter, by telegram in private cipher, and increasingly by the new instrument that Alexander Graham Bell had patented in 1876, and that the trust had installed throughout its eastern operations by 1885. The Standard Oil cipher books, when they were eventually subpoenaed by federal investigators 20 years later, ran to several thousand entries. Doctor meant the price of kerosene. Susan meant the New York Central Railroad. Morose meant a competitor was to be ruined. Anchorite meant the question would be deferred to the next morning's meeting. The lexicon of the trust was not, in its origin, a paranoid invention. It was a practical necessity for an enterprise whose decisions, if telegraphed in plain English, could be read by every freight clerk between Cleveland and Constable Hook. The culture of the executive committee mirrored the culture of its president. Rockefeller, by the middle 1880s, had become a man of almost monastic personal habit. He rose at 6 o'clock. He breakfasted upon bread, milk, and a single piece of fruit. He attended Bible class at the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church on Sundays and led a class of his own. He neither smoked nor drank. He played golf, beginning around the age of 55, on a private course of his own design at his Pocantico estate, with a trained boy walking alongside him to spot his ball. He gave away no public utterances. He answered no journalists. He maintained, even within the trust's own offices, a habit of saying as little as a man in his position could say, and writing less. "Silence is golden," he once told his son. "Speech is silvern." It was, in its way, the operative motto of the corporation. The trust's culture of secrecy was reinforced from the bottom by an internal rule formalized in 1886, that no Standard Oil employee was to discuss the affairs of the company with any person outside its employ, including, the rule specified, members of his own household. The rule was enforced unevenly but seriously. 2 clerks in the New York office in the spring of 1890 were dismissed for having spoken to a world reporter at a saloon on Lower Pine Street. Their dismissal was confirmed at the executive committee on the morning following the conversation. The committee was informed of the conversation by an internal source whose identity, at this distance, cannot be reconstructed. There appears to have been one in nearly every department. The man at the center of this apparatus, by the close of the 1880s, was no longer well. Rockefeller had begun, around 1890, to suffer a cluster of stress-related afflictions that the medical profession of his day could neither name nor remedy. He developed digestive troubles severe enough to confine him for weeks at a time to a diet of milk and crackers. He suffered from a chronic nervous exhaustion that his physicians described, in the medical vocabulary of the period, as neurasthenia. By the spring of 1891, his hair had begun to fall out. The condition, which had no name then, but which the dermatology of the 20th century would identify as alopecia universalis, took from him in the course of 1891 and 1892 the hair of his head, his eyebrows, his eyelashes, and the fine hair of his arms. He was photographed in the late 1890s as a man who appeared at the age of 58 to be a man of 75. The face that had been ordinary became, in those years, the face by which he is now remembered, sealed and unreadable, the eyes set deep in a head that no longer had the softening of any hair upon it. The transformation was so complete that childhood acquaintances who had not seen him in 2 decades passed him in the street without recognition. He withdrew from the daily management of the trust. The withdrawal was not announced. It was not, in any formal sense, a retirement. He continued to hold the office of President of the Standard Oil Trust, and after 1899, the office of President of Standard Oil of New Jersey, the entity into which the trust was transferred when the courts of Ohio at last ordered the dissolution of the original instrument. He simply ceased to attend the morning meetings of the executive committee with regularity. By 1897, at the age of 58, he had stopped attending altogether. His successor in active management, John Dustin Archbold, the same Archbold who had burned him in effigy in Titusville a quarter-century earlier, ran the trust thereafter with a daily authority that was Rockefeller's only in name. Rockefeller himself, in those years, divided his time between his Manhattan brownstone, his Pocantico estate at Tarrytown, and a winter cottage at Forest Hill in Cleveland. He played his 9 holes of golf each morning with a careful slowness that the boys who carried his clubs found maddening. He oversaw, with the same minute attention he had once brought to refinery operations, the planting of his trees and the laying out of his carriage roads. He read the Bible in the evenings. He approved, by letter, the philanthropies that his adviser, Frederick Taylor Gates, had begun to organize on his behalf. The University of Chicago, founded in 1890 with an initial Rockefeller gift of $600,000, would eventually receive $35 million from him. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, the future Rockefeller Foundation, and the Spelman Seminary for the daughters of freed slaves in Atlanta. He gave, in the closing 2 decades of his life, more money to philanthropy than any private American had previously possessed, and he did it from a chair in a glass-walled garden room at Pocantico, in a bald and silent old age that had begun while he was still in his 50s. He had become, by 1897, a man whom the country could no longer see and could not stop talking about. Outside the gates of Pocantico, in the years he had withdrawn behind them, the public mood was turning. The farm states of the Middle West, ruined by falling commodity prices and convinced that the trusts were the cause, had elected populist governors and had sent a generation of trust-hostile representatives to the Congress. The Ohio Attorney General, David Kingsley Watson, had filed quo warranto proceedings against the Standard Oil Company of Ohio in 1890, and had won, in March of 1892, a judgment from the Ohio Supreme Court that ordered the dissolution of the original 1882 trust agreement. The trust had complied in form, dissolving the certificates and reorganizing its holdings into Standard Oil of New Jersey under a more permissive New Jersey corporate statute, while preserving every operational reality of the prior arrangement. The form was satisfied, the substance was unchanged. The country, however, was watching now with a different intensity than it had watched before. In a small house in the Allegheny oil town of Titusville, in those same years, the daughter of a producer ruined by the South Improvement Scheme of 1872 had begun to keep, in her quiet, methodical hand, a file of newspaper clippings about the trust that would in time grow to fill a wooden cabinet in the Manhattan offices of McClure's magazine. Her name was Ida Minerva Tarbell. She was 40 years old. She had not yet decided what she would do with the file. The decision would come. She had been born on November 23, 1857, in a log farmhouse in Hatch Hollow, Erie County, Pennsylvania, 2 years before Edwin Drake's well at Titusville changed the country into which she had been born. Her father, Franklin Sumner Tarbell, was a carpenter and joiner of unhurried temperament who taught himself the trade of making the wooden tanks in which crude oil was stored at the wellhead, and by the late 1860s he had turned this small competence into a modest interest as an independent oil producer in the Pennsylvania fields. The Tarbells were not rich. They were what the country called comfortable. Their house at Rouseville stood on a tilted hillside above Oil Creek, and the porch, in the daughter's later remembrance, looked out upon a forest of derricks that pumped night and day and turned the water of the creek black at every freshet. She remembered, all her life, the spring of 1872, when the news of the South Improvement contracts reached the Pennsylvania oil regions and the producers' meetings began in the lamp-lit halls of Titusville. She was 14 years old. Her father came home one evening in March from a meeting at the Producers' Union, his coat smelling of wood smoke and his face changed in a way she could not at first read. She watched him cross the kitchen and sit down at the table without speaking. "The Cleveland refiners," he said at last, "are going to ruin us." And then he told her mother, in a low and careful voice, what he had heard. The Tarbell refinery, like most of the small Pennsylvania works, did not survive the consolidations of the next 4 years. Franklin Tarbell sold his interest at a fraction of its pre-war value and returned, in his 50s, to the carpentry trade. His friend and partner, an oil region merchant named McClintock, took the loss less philosophically. He hanged himself in the woods above Oil Creek in the autumn of 1876. Franklin Tarbell carried his daughter to the funeral. The girl who walked with her father along the wagon road that morning was 16 years old and was taking, even then, the careful inward measure of the men who had done this thing. She was an unusual child. She read the Bible in the manner her family expected of her, but she also read, with a fierce private appetite, the lives of women whose lives had not been ordinary. By the age of 14, she decided she would not marry, that she would go to college, and that she would, in some way she could not yet specify, do work that mattered. In 1876, she enrolled at Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania, the only woman in her freshman class. She studied biology with a particular fondness for microscopy and graduated in 1880 with a Bachelor of Arts degree. She was the only female graduate of the institution that year. She returned to teach for 2 years at the Poland Union Seminary in Ohio, found the work narrow, and in 1883 accepted a position with a magazine published out of Meadville called The Chautauquan, the Journal of the Chautauqua Adult Education Movement, then at the height of its national influence. For the next 8 years, she did the unglamorous work of a junior editor on a serious-minded periodical. She wrote unsigned articles on French history, on women's suffrage, on the chemical composition of common foods. She read manuscripts. She corresponded with contributors. She acquired, in the steady accumulating way that journalism teaches, the discipline of fact. She also acquired an interest in the lives of women who had taken part in great public events, and in the mechanics of how power was actually wielded in the institutions of the modern state. By the autumn of 1890, she had decided that the work she could do at the Chautauquan had reached its limit. She informed the editor that she was leaving for Paris to write a serious life of Madame Roland, the Girondin hostess of the French Revolution who was guillotined in 1793, and to support herself by freelance journalism as Paris would furnish. She arrived in the city in November of 1891, with $150 in her purse and no command of spoken French beyond the textbook variety. She rented a small apartment on the Rue de Sommerard, in the Latin Quarter behind the Sorbonne, and took her meals at a pension where the other boarders were Polish medical students and a stout Englishwoman who lived on postal orders from a brother in Manchester. She read in the Bibliothèque Nationale 6 days a week. She wrote her letters home at a desk near the window. She filed dispatches for the Pittsburgh Dispatch, for Scribner's, and, beginning in the spring of 1892, for a struggling new American periodical edited out of New York by a wiry Irishman of irrepressible enthusiasm named Samuel Sidney McClure. McClure had founded McClure's magazine in the spring of 1893. He was a man of intuitions rather than principles, and his intuitions, when they were right, were better than other men's principles. He had read Tarbell's freelance work in the Pittsburgh Dispatch and had taken the transatlantic ferry to Paris on the strength of a single afternoon's reading. He arrived at her apartment on the Rue de Sommerard one September morning in 1892 without prior notice, sat upon her one good chair, and offered her a position on his magazine. She declined. She had not yet finished her Life of Madame Roland. He returned the following spring with a better offer, and a third time the year after. In the autumn of 1894, after the publication of her Roland and the appearance of her serialized Life of Napoleon in McClure's, she at last accepted, and returned to New York to take up the position of associate editor of the magazine that would become, over the next decade, the most consequential journal of investigative reporting that the American Republic had so far produced. Her first major undertaking for the magazine was a serial life of Abraham Lincoln, drawn in part from the recollections of men who had known him before the presidency and which had not been gathered, before Tarbell, with any seriousness. The series ran through 1895 and 1896, doubled the magazine's circulation, and established Tarbell as one of the highest-paid magazine writers in the country. By the close of the decade, McClure's had assembled, under McClure's eccentric stewardship, a stable of writers that included Lincoln Steffens, Ray Stannard Baker, William Allen White, and the staff novelist Willa Cather, soon to be promoted to managing editor. The magazine had committed itself, by its own internal sense of mission and by McClure's restless ambition, to a kind of journalism that no American periodical had previously attempted at scale. They would, the editorial position held, look thoroughly and with documentary patience into the institutions that were reshaping American life, and they would publish what they found, regardless of where the looking led. In a meeting at the magazine's Manhattan offices in the autumn of 1901, McClure proposed to his senior editors that the magazine undertake an extended study of the great industrial trusts. The country had by then 73 of them, controlling, by the estimates of the day, the larger share of the productive capital of every major industry. McClure proposed the United States Steel Corporation, the Sugar Trust, the Beef Trust, and Standard Oil as candidates. The editors discussed the matter for the better part of an afternoon. By the close of the meeting, they had agreed that Standard Oil should be the first study, that it would be a serial of perhaps 3 articles, and that the writer to undertake the work was the woman in their offices who had grown up in its shadow. Tarbell accepted the assignment with the careful matter-of-factness she brought to everything. She told McClure that she would not be able to write 3 articles. She would, she said, require somewhat more space and somewhat more time than that. She set out upon the work in the winter of 1901 and would not finish it until the autumn of 1904. The research that she undertook in that interval has remained, in the century since, one of the standards by which serious investigative reporting in the United States is measured. She read, by her own later account, every public document she could locate concerning the trust, including the testimony before the Hepburn Committee of the New York Legislature in 1879, the testimony before the Industrial Commission of 1900, the state of Ohio's Quo Warranto proceedings of 1890, The Federal Interstate Commerce Commission rulings on petroleum freight rates from 1887 forward, the trade journals of the oil regions for the entire span from 1870 through 1901, and the personal papers of any man, living or dead, whose family would receive her in their parlor and produce them. She traveled to Cleveland, to Pittsburgh, to Titusville, to Oil City, to Bradford, to Buffalo, and to a dozen smaller towns whose principal citizens she sought out. She kept her notes upon index cards in a tall oak filing cabinet that she had moved into her apartment on Henderson Place in Manhattan. By the close of the second year, the cabinet was full. She had a second one shipped down from Maine. In the spring of 1902, an extraordinary thing occurred. Tarbell received, through the offices of the reformer and clergyman, Mark Twain, an invitation to call upon Henry Huddleston Rogers, the executive vice president of Standard Oil, and one of the 9 men of the original trust. Rogers was 62 years old. He was Twain's close personal friend, having quietly rescued the writer from financial ruin some years earlier and managed, with great delicacy, the restoration of his fortunes. He had read Tarbell's Lincoln. He admired her seriousness. He proposed on his own initiative and without the knowledge of his colleagues at the Trust that she might come to 26 Broadway and put her questions to him directly, that he might correct what he believed to be the inaccuracies that would otherwise enter her work. She accepted. For the next 2 years, she met with Rogers in his private office on the 11th floor of the Standard Oil Building roughly once a fortnight. He showed her ledgers, he confirmed dates, he sketched, upon scraps of paper which she was permitted to keep, the diagrams of pipeline acquisitions and the lines of railroad rebate that no journalist had previously been permitted to see. He believed, in his own private accounting, that he was managing Tarbell rather than informing her. He had misjudged. The information he provided, supplemented by her own documentary research, became the spine of the published series. When the first article appeared in McClure's in November of 1902, and Rogers read in his office the careful and devastating reconstruction of the South Improvement Scheme of 1872, he is said to have set the magazine down upon his desk, walked to the window, and looked out for a long time at the harbor of New York. The series ran in McClure's magazine from November of 1902 through October of 1904 in 19 installments, totaling rather more than 250,000 words. It was illustrated in the magazine's elegant manner, with half-tone reproductions of the principal documents Tarbell had recovered, the rebate schedules, the trust certificates, the ledger entries, the photographs of the men of the executive committee. The first articles took up the founding of the company and the South Improvement Scheme. The middle articles described the absorptions of Pittsburgh, the freight wars with the Pennsylvania, the Tidewater Pipeline, the 1882 Trust Agreement, the cipher books, and the operating methods of the Executive Committee. The final articles described the political activities of the Trust, including the documented bribery of legislators in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, and in the federal Congress. The closing installment, published in October of 1904, under the title The Legitimate Greatness of the Standard Oil Company, offered a final assessment that praised, in measured language, the genuine industrial achievements of the Trust, and condemned, in language equally measured, the methods by which they had been won. Tarbell had set out to be fair. She had succeeded in being more devastating than any unfair writer could have been. The magazine doubled its circulation a second time. The bound book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, was published by McClure, Phillips and Company in November of 1904, in 2 volumes, 860 pages, with appendices reproducing in full the principal documents. It was reviewed in nearly every periodical in the English-speaking world. It was translated into German, French, Italian, and Japanese within 3 years. It became, almost upon publication, the foundational text in the public understanding of the trust and the principal document in the public case against it. Within the offices at 26 Broadway, the response was a careful silence. John Davison Rockefeller, in private correspondence to John Dustin Archbold, advised that the trust make no public reply to Miss Tarbell. "Not a word," he wrote, "not a word about that misguided woman." Archbold complied. The trust's only published response, when at last it came, was a pamphlet of corrections issued by a Standard Oil publicist named Joseph Bishop in 1905, which Tarbell answered in McClure's the following month with the documents Bishop had not addressed. The exchange was uneven. Bishop did not return to it. The trust returned to its silence and waited for the public mood to pass. The mood did not pass. In the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, a man who had read the McClure's series with attention had been thinking about it for nearly 2 years. He had himself been the youngest president in the history of the Republic, ascending to the office on the assassination of William McKinley in September of 1901. He had committed himself, against the wishes of much of his own party, to the proposition that the federal government must at last assert its authority over the great combinations of industrial capital that had grown up in the country during the half-century since the Civil War. He had read Tarbell. He had read also, with care, the report of the Federal Bureau of Corporations on the petroleum industry, completed in the spring of 1906. By the autumn of that year, he had instructed his Attorney General to prepare proceedings against the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, the long-dormant statute that had not previously been enforced against any combination of consequence. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. The case he had ordered prepared would be filed on the 15th of November, 1906, in the Federal Circuit Court for the Eastern District of Missouri at St. Louis. It would be styled United States of America versus Standard Oil Company of New Jersey et al. It would consume, in its depositions and arguments, the next 4.5 years. The verdict would be delivered, when it at last came, in the marble chamber of the Supreme Court of the United States on the 15th of May, 1911. The statute under which the case was filed had been enacted, with little debate and less expectation, by the 51st Congress of the United States, 16 years before Theodore Roosevelt instructed his Attorney General to prosecute it. It had been introduced by John Sherman of Ohio, the brother of the general, a man whose long legislative career had been chiefly concerned with the regulation of the currency. Sherman had filed his bill in December of 1889. He had drafted it, by his own later admission, in language so general that it could mean very nearly whatever a federal court might in time decide it should mean. Every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy, in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states, or with foreign nations, the statute provided, is hereby declared to be illegal. The act passed the Senate by a vote of 52-1. It passed the House without recorded division. President Benjamin Harrison signed it into law on the 2nd of July, 1890. The bill that had been intended in part as a gesture toward the rising public anger about the trusts, and which had been opposed by no faction of any consequence in the Congress, had become, by the close of that summer, the most general grant of anti-monopoly authority that any government in the English-speaking world had so far enacted. The administrations that followed did almost nothing with it. In the first 8 years of the Sherman Act's existence, the Department of Justice brought only a handful of prosecutions and lost most of them. The Supreme Court itself, in the case of United States v. Knight Company in 1895, held that the Sherman Act did not reach a sugar refining combination that controlled 98% of American refining capacity on the technical ground that manufacturing was not commerce. The decision was widely understood, in the editorial pages of the period, to have rendered the statute a dead letter. The Cleveland administration accepted the ruling without appeal. The McKinley administration, which followed in 1897, was openly friendly to the great trusts and brought no significant prosecution under the Act in either of its terms. By the close of the 19th century, the Sherman Act stood upon the federal statute books as a kind of monument to congressional intention, much admired by editorial writers and entirely unenforced. This was the legal landscape into which Theodore Roosevelt unexpectedly arrived on the 14th of September, 1901. He had not been intended for the office. Mark Hanna of Ohio, the old industrialist who had built the McKinley coalition and who served as the Republican Party's effective national chairman, had opposed Roosevelt's nomination as vice president in 1900 on the explicit ground that Roosevelt was an unstable man whose presence one heartbeat from the presidency was an unacceptable risk to the established order. Don't any of you realize that Hanna had asked the convention that there's only one life between this madman and the White House? The convention had nominated Roosevelt anyway. 8 days after the assassination of William McKinley by the anarchist Leon Czolgosz at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, the madman was sworn into the office at the Ansley Wilcox House on Delaware Avenue. He was 42 years old. He was the youngest president in the history of the Republic. He was the first president since Andrew Jackson who had not been chosen by the political men who chose presidents. Within 90 days of taking office, Roosevelt directed his Attorney General, Philander Chase Knox, to file suit under the Sherman Act against the Northern Securities Company, a railroad holding company that had been organized in November of 1901 by James Jerome Hill and the Morgan banking interests to combine the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy railroads under a single corporate umbrella. The suit was filed on the 10th of March, 1902. It was, by Roosevelt's own subsequent assessment, the most consequential single act of his first term. The Supreme Court of the United States, in March of 1904, sustained the government's position by a vote of 5-4 and ordered the dissolution of Northern Securities. The Sherman Act, after 14 years of dormancy, had been used. It had won. The man who had used it became in the editorial pages of the country, the trust buster. The next case was already in preparation. In February of 1903, at Roosevelt's request, the Congress had created within the Department of Commerce and Labor a new agency, the Bureau of Corporations, with the statutory authority to investigate the operations of any interstate corporation and to publish its findings. The Bureau's first commissioner was a Boston attorney named James Rudolph Garfield, the son of the assassinated president. Garfield's first major investigation, opened in the spring of 1904, was of the petroleum industry. His investigators worked for nearly 2 years. They subpoenaed records. They took testimony from independent oil producers in the Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Kansas fields. They examined freight schedules. They reconstructed the rebate and drawback structures that had survived in modified form into the new century. The Bureau of Corporations report on the petroleum industry was issued in 2 volumes, in May and August of 1906. It documented, in the patient prose of federal investigators, that Standard Oil continued in the year 1906 to receive secret rebates from the railroads on a scale forbidden by the Elkins Act of 1903, and that the trust controlled, by various means, 87% of the refining capacity of the United States and 90% of the long-distance petroleum pipelines. The report was forwarded by Garfield to the Attorney General, William Henry Moody, with a recommendation that proceedings be opened. Moody concurred. Roosevelt approved. On the 15th of November, 1906, 3 months after the publication of the Bureau's second volume, the United States filed in the Federal Circuit Court for the Eastern District of Missouri at St. Louis a bill of equity seeking the dissolution of the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey and its 65 subsidiary corporations. The defendants were named individually as well as institutionally. They included John Davison Rockefeller, William Rockefeller, Henry Morrison Flagler, John Dustin Archbold, Henry Huddleston Rogers, and the lawyer Samuel Calvin Tate Dodd, who had been retired from the Trust's general counsel position only 2 years earlier, and who was named, by particular irony, as a co-defendant in the prosecution of an instrument that he himself had drafted. The lead prosecutor for the United States was a Minnesota lawyer named Frank Billings Kellogg, 50 years old, the senior partner of his St. Paul firm, who had been retained as a special prosecutor for the case at the request of the Attorney General. Kellogg was a man of careful, almost forensic temperament. He prepared the government's case across the next 2 years with a thoroughness that the Trust's own counsel would later, in private, acknowledge as exemplary. He took, in the course of those 2 years, the depositions of 444 witnesses in courtrooms and offices in 21 states. The trial transcript, when at last it was lodged with the court, ran to 12,000 pages of testimony and included some 400 separate exhibits, the majority of them documents drawn from the Trust's own files under subpoena. Among the depositions were those of John Davison Rockefeller himself. The Trust's principal had not been examined under oath in any forum of consequence in nearly 20 years. He had become, in the public imagination, a figure approaching the mythical, a bald and silent old man behind the gates of Pocantico, who issued no statements, granted no interviews, and was photographed, when at all, against his preference. The depositions broke, for the first time, this long withholding. Kellogg deposed Rockefeller across 3 separate sessions in 1907 and 1908, the first at the Standard Oil offices at 26 Broadway, the second at the Federal Courthouse in New York, the third at Rockefeller's own residence at Forest Hill, Cleveland. The depositions, when they were transcribed, ran to several hundred pages. They are the most extended record that exists of John Davison Rockefeller's manner of speech under direct questioning. The manner was unhurried, courteous, and almost entirely unyielding. To questions concerning the South Improvement Company of 1872, he replied that his memory of the period was no longer distinct, and that he could not, at this distance, recall the details of arrangements that other officers of the company had primarily managed. To questions concerning the trust agreement of 1882, he replied that the document had been drawn by counsel and that he had relied upon his counsel's judgment as to its legality. To questions concerning the present operations of the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, he replied that he had retired from active management more than 10 years earlier and could not speak to current practices in any informed way. The pattern was so consistent across the 3 sessions that Kellogg, in his closing summary to the court, would describe the depositions as useful chiefly as a study in the deliberate forgetting of large affairs. The trial itself opened before a special panel of the Federal Circuit Court at St. Louis in the early spring of 1909. The presiding judge was Walter Henry Sanborn of Minnesota, a careful and conservative jurist who had been on the federal bench for nearly 2 decades. Beside him sat Judges Willis Van Devanter, William Cather Hook, and Elmer Bragg Adams. The trust's defense was led by John Graver Johnson of Philadelphia, the most distinguished corporate advocate then practicing at the American bar, who had argued, by the year of the trial, more cases before the Supreme Court of the United States than any other living attorney. The arguments ran for the better part of 3 months. The transcripts of the oral arguments alone filled 4 printed volumes. Kellogg's case rested upon a structural argument and a documentary one. The structural argument was that the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey was, in actual operation, if not in formal title, a continuation of the 1882 trust agreement under a different corporate vehicle, and that the dissolution ordered by the Ohio Supreme Court in 1892 had been complied with in form and evaded in substance. The documentary argument was the cumulative record of 70 refining acquisitions, of more than 120 separate freight rate arrangements, of the Tidewater absorption, of the Empire Transportation purchase, of the South Improvement contracts, and of the cipher books and rebate ledgers that the Trust's own subpoenaed records had produced. The defense argued, in reply, that Standard Oil's dominance was the product of superior efficiency, that its prices to the consumer had fallen across the period of its dominance, and that the consolidations it had undertaken were lawful exercises of corporate liberty under the laws of the several states in which the underlying corporations had been chartered. The 4-judge panel deliberated for the better part of 7 months. On the 20th of November, 1909, the panel issued its unanimous opinion, written by Judge Sanborn. The court found for the government on every material count. It held that Standard Oil of New Jersey was a combination in restraint of interstate commerce within the meaning of the Sherman Act. It held that the holding company had been organized for the purpose of evading the Ohio dissolution decree of 1892. It held that the railroad rebate practices documented by the Bureau of Corporations were unlawful in themselves and constituted further evidence of the combinatory intent of the principals. The court ordered the dissolution of the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey into its constituent subsidiary corporations within 30 days of the entry of final decree, and enjoined the principals from any further association in concert that would tend toward the reconstitution of the original combination. The defendants, as had been expected on every side, gave notice of appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States within the statutory period. The case was docketed for argument in the October term of 1910. The argument before the Supreme Court would be heard when at last it came, by a court whose Chief Justice had recently been appointed by the man who had succeeded Theodore Roosevelt in the presidency, William Howard Taft, the same Taft who had served as Roosevelt's Secretary of War and had been understood, by Roosevelt and by the country, as Roosevelt's chosen instrument of continuity. The Chief Justice was a Louisiana former senator, Edward Douglas White, 65 years old, who had been elevated from Associate Justice to the Chief's chair only the year before. White was a careful man with a careful mind, a former Confederate soldier of conservative temperament whose previous opinions had given the Trust's counsel some grounds for cautious hope. The Trust's counsel had misread him. The argument before the Supreme Court would be heard in January of 1911. The opinion would be read from the bench by the Chief Justice on the 15th of May of that year. The end was now 4 months away. The argument before the Supreme Court of the United States opened in the Marble Chamber on the morning of January 16, 1911, and continued through 3 full court days. The chamber in which the case was heard was not the present Grand Chamber of the modern Supreme Court building, which would not be completed for another quarter-century, but the older chamber on the ground floor of the Capitol that the court had occupied since the days of Roger Brooke Taney. The room was small, warm, and crowded. The principal counsel for the United States was Frank Billings Kellogg, the same Minnesota lawyer who had prepared the case at St. Louis. Beside him at the government's table sat the new Attorney General, George Woodward Wickersham, who had succeeded Charles Bonaparte upon Taft's accession. The principal counsel for the trust was John Graver Johnson of Philadelphia, white-bearded by then and 70 years old, whose voice had grown thin in his later years, but whose grasp of the record was such that he was said to require no notes upon any matter of detail. The arguments occupied 12 hours of court time across the 3 days. Johnson conceded nothing of consequence. He repeated, with the patience of a man who has made the same case many times, that the consolidation Standard Oil had undertaken across 40 years had been lawful exercises of corporate liberty, that the prices of refined petroleum had fallen by nearly half across the period of the trust's dominance, that the consumer had benefited, that the production had grown more efficient, and that the Sherman Act, properly construed, did not authorize the federal courts to dismantle a combination merely because the combination was large. Kellogg replied with the documentary record, the cipher books, the freight rate schedules, the 70 refining acquisitions, the South Improvement contracts, the Tidewater absorption. He spoke for 6 hours of the 12. He carried no flourish in his manner. He read from the record, and the record carried the case. The court took the matter under advisement on January 18th and retired to its conference. 4 months passed without word. The trust's counsel waited at 26 Broadway, where the executive committee continued its daily meetings under John Dustin Archbold's chairmanship. The Standard Oil price of refined kerosene held steady. The dividends were declared. The internal correspondence of the trust during those 4 months, when it was later examined by historians, conveyed a calm that the principals could not entirely have felt. On the morning of the 15th of May, 1911, the marshal of the court rose at the appointed hour and announced that the court was about to deliver its opinion in United States of America against Standard Oil Company of New Jersey and others. The Chief Justice, Edward Douglas White, took the bench in his black robe and began to read. He read for an hour and 49 minutes. The opinion ran to 20,400 words. It was unanimous, joined by every associate justice with the partial exception of Justice John Marshall Harlan, who concurred in the result but dissented in part from the reasoning in an opinion of his own that he read from the bench immediately afterward. White's opinion sustained, on every material count, the November 1909 ruling of the Federal Circuit Court at St. Louis. It held that the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey was a combination in restraint of interstate commerce within the meaning of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. It held that the holding company had been organized for the purpose of evading the Ohio dissolution decree of 1892. It held that the operations of the trust had been characterized across 40 years by the deliberate suppression of competition through means that the court described as the inferences of intent which necessarily flow from the proven acts. It ordered the dissolution of Standard Oil of New Jersey into its constituent subsidiary corporations, the distribution to the existing trust shareholders of the stock of the dissolved subsidiaries in proportion to their existing holdings, and the permanent enjoyment of the principals from any further association in concert that might tend toward the reconstitution of the original combination. The court allowed the trust 6 months in which to complete the dissolution, but the Chief Justice, in the course of his hour and 49 minutes, also did something that Kellogg had not asked him to do and that Johnson had not dared to hope for. He introduced into the federal antitrust law a new doctrine of construction, which he called the rule of reason. The Sherman Act, on its face, declared every contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade to be illegal. White held, in the central reasoning of his opinion, that the statute could not have meant every such combination, since nearly every commercial contract restrains trade in some degree, and that the court must read into the statute an implicit limitation that confined its prohibition to those combinations which constituted unreasonable restraints of trade. The doctrine, which would govern federal antitrust adjudication for the rest of the 20th century, and which governs it still, narrowed in a single stroke the apparent scope of the statute as it had been understood since 1890. It required the federal courts, in any future antitrust case, to determine not merely whether a combination had restrained trade, but whether the restraint had been unreasonable in its degree and intent. In the case of Standard Oil, the court had no difficulty finding the restraint unreasonable, and the dissolution stood. But Justice Harnell, in his concurrence and partial dissent, perceived at once what the rule of reason would mean in cases less extreme. He read from the bench a separate opinion of considerable heat. He charged that the Chief Justice had usurped the function of Congress, that the Sherman Act as written had required no such judicial gloss, and that the rule of reason was, in his phrase, judicial legislation that would in time hollow out the very statute the court was that morning enforcing. The country, in its first reading of the news, did not yet perceive what Harlan had perceived. The newspapers of the afternoon reported the dissolution as a sweeping victory for the federal government. The New York World called it the most significant ruling on the relations of capital and the state since the Dred Scott decision. The Chicago Tribune called it the end of the trust era. President Taft, in the White House, issued a statement of measured satisfaction. The dissolution of Standard Oil of New Jersey would proceed. The mechanics of the dissolution were carried out across the second half of 1911 by a special committee of Standard Oil officers under the supervision of the federal court at St. Louis. The corporate combination was unbundled into 34 separate corporations, each of which was now obliged, under the terms of the decree, to operate as an independent commercial entity. Among them, by the names they then carried, were the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, which would in time become Exxon, the Standard Oil Company of New York, which would in time become Mobil, the Standard Oil Company of California, which would in time become Chevron, the Standard Oil Company of Indiana, which would in time become Amoco, the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, which would in time become Sohio and then BP America, the Continental Oil Company, which would in time become Conoco, the Atlantic Refining Company, which would merge into Arco, the Vacuum Oil Company, the Galena Signal Oil Company, the South Penn Oil Company, the Solar Refining Company, the Buckeye Pipeline Company, the Indiana Pipeline Company, the Northern Pipeline Company, the New York Transit Company, the National Transit Company, and 17 others of various sizes and specializations. The mechanism by which the dissolution distributed the underlying value to the existing trust shareholders deserves particular notice. Each holder of stock in the parent Standard Oil Company of New Jersey received, in exchange for the shares he had previously held, a proportionate package of the shares of each of the 34 newly independent companies. John Davison Rockefeller, who held some 25% of the parent corporation's stock, received 25% of the shares of every daughter company. The shares were issued at the par values that had obtained within the trust's internal accounting. The market, when it had a chance to evaluate them as independent securities, evaluated them otherwise. Within 3 years of the dissolution, the aggregate market capitalization of the 34 daughter companies had risen to approximately twice the market capitalization that the parent company had carried at the time of the breakup. The freedom that the federal courts had ordered to be granted to each subsidiary turned out, in the operations of the petroleum market, to be a freedom that increased rather than diminished the value each could command. The kerosene markets they had served collectively under the trust's pricing discipline, they now served competitively at margins that the consolidated trust had been unable, by reason of its very dominance, to charge. The new gasoline market, which had not existed in any commercial form when the trust was at its height in the 1880s, was by 1914 the largest single petroleum product market in the world, and each of the daughter companies entered it with the refining infrastructure, the distribution network, and the trained personnel that the trust had spent 40 years assembling. John Davison Rockefeller, who had been the wealthiest American at the time of the dissolution, became wealthier still in the months that followed. By 1913, his personal fortune was estimated at approximately $900 million, a figure that, measured against the gross domestic product of the United States in that year, has not been equaled by any private American before or since. Andrew Carnegie, asked by a journalist for his reaction to the appreciation of the Standard Oil daughter shares, is said to have replied that the Supreme Court had made his old rival, the richest man in the world, a second time. Rockefeller himself received the news of the May 15th ruling at the place to which he had withdrawn for his retirement, the golf course at his Pocantico estate. He had been playing his usual 9 holes that morning in the company of his playing partner of those years, a Catholic priest from a parish near Tarrytown named Father J.P. Lennon, whom Rockefeller had befriended for reasons that no one at Pocantico ever fully understood, the Baptist tycoon and the Irish priest having little in common beyond a shared dislike of being kept waiting on the tee. A messenger came up the cart path with the wire from 26 Broadway. Rockefeller read it, folded it, and placed it in his coat pocket. He looked toward the green for a moment without speaking. "Father Lennon," he said at last, "have you some money?" The priest replied that he had not. "Well," said Rockefeller, "buy Standard Oil." He was 71 years old. He had been enjoined by the Supreme Court of the United States from any further association with the men who had built the corporation that had borne his name for 41 years. The corporation itself had been ordered into 34 pieces to be unbundled and set against one another in the open market for the first time in their working lives. The shareholders to whom this dispersal would shortly transfer wealth on a scale none of them had previously imagined included himself, in proportion to a quarter of the whole. He was, that morning on the 7th fairway at Pocantico, in the deepest sense neither defeated nor diminished. He had simply been required by the federal sovereign to transfer his fortune from one form into another in which it would prove to be larger. The country, when it understood what had happened, did not entirely know what to call the result. It had set out, by the long campaign that began with Tarbell and proceeded through Roosevelt and Kellogg and Sanborn, and at last to Edward White, to break the most thorough monopoly in American history. It had succeeded, and in succeeding it had multiplied the man who had built that monopoly into a man whose private wealth would outlast, by every measure, the corporate combination by which he had earned it. There remained, beneath the resolution that the May 15th ruling had appeared to provide, a deeper unease. The trust had been broken in form. The substance, in a manner that the law had not contemplated, had been redistributed rather than dismantled. The country would discover in time that the men who had absorbed the trust's lessons most thoroughly were now operating 34 separate corporations under 34 different names, in 34 different markets, no longer obliged to coordinate by cipher books or unrecorded committee meetings, but at liberty to do, by the parallel workings of their independent judgment, very nearly what the trust had previously done by command. The deeper unease would in time have a different name attached to it, and a different state at the center of it, and a different verdict still to be returned. But before that final reckoning could be examined, the country would have to look at one further episode that the Trust's long architecture had made inevitable, and at the price that the empire had required of the men and women whose labor had built it. That price had been paid in a Colorado canyon in the spring of 1914 in a tent colony beside a railroad siding on a hillside above a creek called Berwind. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company passed into the Rockefeller orbit in the autumn of 1892 in the manner of a great many absorptions of those years by way of a quiet purchase of a controlling interest through New York intermediaries. The company was the largest single industrial enterprise in the state of Colorado. It owned, by the close of the 19th century, 27 coal mines distributed across the southern counties of Las Animas and Huerfano, 4 iron mines in the western part of the state, the steel works at Pueblo that supplied the rails for half the railroads of the western Trans-Mississippi, and the company-owned towns in which its workmen and their families lived. The towns were not, in the legal sense, incorporated municipalities. They were properties of the company. The houses were leased to the miners at rents the company set. The stores in which the miners bought their flour and their salt pork and their kerosene were owned by the company. The schools their children attended were staffed by teachers whose salaries the company paid. The doctors who attended their illnesses were retained by the company. The deputies who kept the peace upon the streets were sworn in by the company's own foreman. The pastors who preached upon Sundays in the company-built chapels held their pulpits at the company's pleasure. The man who had purchased the controlling interest, John Davison Rockefeller, had never visited the southern Colorado coal fields. He would not visit them in his lifetime. After his withdrawal from active management around 1897, the management of the family's interest in the company passed to his only son, John Davison Rockefeller, Jr., who had taken his Brown University degree in 1897 and had entered the offices of his father's enterprises at 26 Broadway upon graduation. The younger Rockefeller, by the early 1910s, was a slight, anxious, principled man of middle age whose central professional concern was the management of the family's industrial holdings and whose private life in those years was marked by a religious seriousness more austere even than his father's. He had not visited the southern Colorado coal fields either. The conditions in those coal fields by the autumn of 1913 had become difficult to defend even within the trade press of the industry. The accident rate in Colorado coal mines had run, for the prior decade, at more than twice the national average. In the year 1912 alone, the state's coal mines had killed 327 men in a working population that did not exceed 15,000. The wages were paid by tonnage in scrip, redeemable only at company stores. The 8-hour workday, which the Colorado legislature had enacted in 1905, was honored in the coal fields, chiefly in its breach. The Colorado State Mine Inspector's Office had been, by general acknowledgment, an instrument of the operators since its creation. The miners were of varied origin. Many were recently arrived from Greece, Italy, Mexico, the Slavic and Hungarian provinces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the coal fields of southern Wales. They spoke among them perhaps 24 languages. They had organized in fits and starts in the prior 2 decades. They had been broken every time. In August of 1913, organizers of the United Mine Workers of America entered the southern Colorado fields in earnest, holding meetings in Trinidad and in the smaller camps along the Purgatoire River, drafting a list of 7 demands. The demands were not extravagant: recognition of the Union, enforcement of the existing 8-hour law, pay for the time spent on so-called dead work, the unpaid labor of timbering and rock removal that the miners performed before the paid extraction of coal could begin, the right to elect their own checkweighman, to verify the tonnage upon which their wages would be calculated, the right to trade at any store, to live in any house, and to call any doctor of their own choosing. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, on the explicit instructions of its president Lamont Montgomery Bowers, and with the approval of the office at 26 Broadway, refused to receive the union representatives. The strike was called on the 23rd of September, 1913. Between 8,000 to 9,000 miners walked out, the great majority of the workforce in the southern fields. The company had anticipated the strike and had prepared its response. Within 72 hours of the walkout, the families of the striking miners were evicted from the company-owned houses. They left, in many cases, in heavy autumn rain, carrying their possessions in handcarts to a series of tent colonies that the Union had pre-positioned upon leased land along the rail lines and the creek bottoms below the mine camps. The largest of these tent colonies, established upon a 40-acre tract leased from a sympathetic farmer beside the Colorado and Southern Railway tracks, 6 miles north of the town of Trinidad and on a low bench above a creek called Berwind, took the name of Ludlow. The Ludlow colony, by the close of October 1913, contained roughly 1,200 persons in approximately 200 tents arranged in regular streets. The tents had been ordered from the same firms that supplied the United States Army. They were of canvas, with wood plank floors that the miners had sawn and laid themselves. The colony had a central common where the children played, a small clinic staffed by Union doctors, and a Greek Orthodox priest who held services on Sundays for the considerable Greek and Bulgarian population among the strikers. The leader of the camp was a Greek immigrant of 33 years named Louis Tikas, who had taken his American citizenship the previous year and who served as the Union's principal organizer for the southern fields. He was tall, dark-haired, and unusually calm in negotiation. The Colorado mine operators, in private correspondence, called him the most dangerous man in the strike, by which they meant the most patient. The first deaths came in October. Company guards employed through the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, a private security firm out of Bluefield, West Virginia, that had previously been used in the West Virginia coalfield disputes and that had earned, in those campaigns, a reputation for ruthlessness in the protection of operator interests, opened fire upon a striker funeral procession near Ludlow on the 7th of October, killing 1 miner and wounding 4 others. The company guards then constructed, upon a flatbed Ford truck, an armored vehicle mounting a Colt machine gun, which the strikers came to call the Death Special, and which made unannounced patrols past the tent colonies through the autumn. 2 strikers were killed in a Death Special drive-by in late October. The miners armed themselves against the explicit instructions of the United Mine Workers leadership with rifles purchased through the Sears, Roebuck mail-order catalog and shipped into the colonies in crates marked as agricultural implements. On the 28th of October, 1913, Governor Elias Milton Ammons of Colorado, under heavy pressure from the operators and against the advice of his own Attorney General, ordered the deployment of the Colorado National Guard to the southern coal fields. The Guard, when it arrived, behaved at first with neutrality. By the early months of 1914, however, the state had run out of funds to pay the deployed guardsmen, and the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, with the governor's tacit approval, began to pay the wages of the militiamen directly from company accounts. The neutrality of the Guard did not survive the change in its paymaster. By the spring of 1914, the guard companies in the field at Ludlow consisted increasingly of company guards in National Guard uniforms, supplemented by Baldwin Felts agents who had been issued state militia commissions for the convenience of the arrangement. The winter of 1913 to 1914 passed in the tent colony at Ludlow in unspeakable cold. The temperature at Trinidad fell in early February of that year to 20 degrees below zero. The canvas tents were heated by small cast-iron stoves with stovepipes vented through the roofs. Children were born in the colony that winter. 2 of them died of pneumonia within a fortnight of their birth. The strikers held their lines. The mines remained shut. The company replaced its workforce, slowly and incompletely, with strikebreakers brought in from outside the state, who lived under armed guard within the company-owned camps that had been emptied in September. The events of the 20th of April, 1914, have been reconstructed many times by the Walsh Commission, by the historians who came after, and by the Union's own internal investigation, with results that diverge in detail but agree in substance. At approximately 10 o'clock that morning, after a series of small confrontations across the prior 48 hours, a National Guard company under Major Patrick Hamrock and Lieutenant Carl Linderfelt opened fire upon the Ludlow tent colony from positions on the railroad embankment to the south, and from a hill called Water Tank Hill to the east. The strikers returned the fire from rifle pits they had dug beneath their tents during the winter. The exchange of fire continued through the day. By late afternoon, the militia had brought up 2 machine guns and was firing them sustainedly into the tent rows. The colony's residents, women and children among them, took shelter wherever they could, in the rifle pits, in dugout cellar holes beneath several of the tents, and in a depression in the ground at the colony's east end that had been used for the storage of root vegetables. In the early evening, with the firing still continuing, the tent colony caught fire. The cause of the fire has been disputed since that night. The strikers said the militia had set it. The militia said it had been started by an overturned stove during the firefight. The Walsh Commission, after taking testimony, concluded that the evidence supported the strikers. Whatever the cause, the canvas tents burned in succession, the fire spreading rapidly along the rows in the dry April wind. A pit beneath one of the tents at the south end of the colony, a hole some 6 feet square and 4 feet deep, in which a group of women and children had taken shelter from the gunfire, was sealed by the burning canvas of the tent above it. The 11 children and 2 women in the pit suffocated where they crouched. They were found the following morning by a Red Cross volunteer named Sadie Costa. Louis Ticas, the camp leader, was captured by Lieutenant Linderfelt during the burning of the colony. He was beaten with the broken stock of a Springfield rifle until the rifle butt shattered, and was then shot 3 times in the back by an unidentified guardsman as he attempted to walk away under his own power. His body was left in the open beside the railroad tracks for 36 hours before the Union was permitted to retrieve it. The death toll of the day, when at last it was tallied, stood at 21 persons, 11 children, 2 women, 8 men. The dead among the militia and the company guards numbered 3. The country, when the news reached it through the morning newspapers of the 21st, did not at first believe what it was reading. By the 22nd, the headlines had grown to fill the upper third of every front page in the eastern cities. The phrase, "the Rocky Mountain News" used upon the morning of the 23rd, was the phrase by which the event entered the historical record. The Ludlow Massacre. The strike continued for 7 months after the burning of the tents. It was at last broken in December of 1914 by the deployment of federal troops ordered into the coal fields by President Woodrow Wilson on the explicit request of Governor Ammons. The miners' demands were not granted. The United Mine Workers organizing campaign in southern Colorado collapsed. The men returned to the mines on the company's terms. But the public reckoning, which had begun before the strike was broken, did not collapse with the strike. In the autumn of 1914, the Congress, on the recommendation of the Department of Labor, established a federal commission on industrial relations under the chairmanship of the Kansas City lawyer Frank Patrick Walsh, with broad subpoena authority to investigate the causes of the Ludlow killings and the broader conduct of American industrial-labor relations. The Walsh Commission held public hearings in 14 cities across the year 1915. It heard testimony from 154 witnesses concerning the Colorado strike alone. Its hearings became, in their effect upon the public mood, what the McClure's serial had been a decade earlier upon a different concentration of Rockefeller capital. They produced a documentary record of the conditions, the company practices, and the chain of decisions by which a tent colony of strikers' families had come to be machine-gunned in the spring of 1914 on a hillside above a creek called Berwind. John Davison Rockefeller, Jr. testified before the Walsh Commission across 2 days, on the 20th and 21st of January 1915, in a Manhattan hearing room crowded with reporters and union men. His testimony, transcribed at length in the morning papers, made him for the first time the object of national public attention apart from his father. He was 39 years old. He had not been to the Colorado coalfields. He had not, before the killings, given the labor situation at the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company any sustained personal attention. He had relied, he told the commission, upon the judgment of the company's president and managers in Colorado. He had received, he acknowledged, no first-hand information from the camps. He defended the principle of the open shop. He defended the conduct of the Colorado management. He answered the commissioners with the careful precision of a man who had not previously known how thin the ground beneath him was. The testimony shifted him. By the autumn of 1915, the younger Rockefeller had hired, as a personal advisor on industrial relations, a 39-year-old Canadian Liberal politician of acute political instinct named William Lyon Mackenzie King, who had served as the first deputy minister of the Canadian Department of Labor and had recently been defeated for re-election to the Canadian Parliament. Mackenzie King designed for him, across the next 2 years, a structured employee representation plan for the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company that became known as the Rockefeller Plan, and which, in the trade union historian's verdict, was the first systematic company union scheme adopted by an American industrial enterprise of the first rank. Mackenzie King would in time return to Canadian politics and become Prime Minister of his country for 22 of the next 35 years. But the central professional achievement of his middle years was the work he did for the younger Rockefeller in the wake of Ludlow. The plan was a substitute for an independent union. It was also a recognition, the first within the Rockefeller circle, that the older silence of the trust would not survive into the new century. The mines reopened. The strikers' families, those that had survived the winter of 1913 and the fire of April, dispersed across the West to find work where they could. Louis Tikas was buried on April 27, 1914, in the Greek Orthodox cemetery at Trinidad, in a service attended by 4,000 miners and their kin. The names of the 11 children and 2 women who had died in the pit beneath the burning tent were inscribed 3 years later upon a granite monument that the United Mine Workers placed on the ground where the tent colony had stood. The monument is there still. The names upon it have not been weathered into illegibility by the wind that blows down out of the Sangre de Cristos and across the bench above the creek called Berwind. The trust had been broken in the marble chamber of the Supreme Court 3 years before the burning of the tents at Ludlow. The capital that had built the trust remained. The 34 corporations that the Supreme Court had unbundled in the autumn of 1911 entered the 20th century as separate vessels carrying the same cargo. Their managements, in the first years after the dissolution, were drawn from the same pool of executives who had served the trust under its consolidated form. Their refining infrastructure had been assembled over 40 years to operate as a single network. Their distribution channels overlapped at almost every consequential market. Their accounting departments answered, in the practical workings of the Eastern petroleum trade, to a common understanding of how the business had always been done. What the court had ordered them to do was to compete. What they did, across the long century that followed, was to grow. The Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, which had been the largest of the daughters at the moment of the dissolution, and which had continued to bear the parent corporation's offices at 26 Broadway, would be renamed SEE in much of the export market in the 1920s, then Humble in parts of the American South in the 1950s, then, in the consolidation of its corporate identity in 1972, Exxon, the Standard Oil Company of New York, which had carried the sober nickname Socony in the trade, would merge with the Vacuum Oil Company in 1931 to form Socony Vacuum, would take the brand name Mobil in 1966, and would shed the corporate standard genealogy entirely in the public mind by the close of the century. The Standard Oil Company of California, which had carried the brand name Chevron from 1936, would absorb the Gulf Oil Corporation in 1984 in what was then the largest industrial merger in the history of the United States. The Standard Oil Company of Indiana would take the brand name Amoco in 1985 after 7 decades of trading under it as a regional identity. The Standard Oil Company of Ohio would become Sohio, would be absorbed by British Petroleum in stages through the 1970s and 80s, and would disappear into what is now BP America. The Continental Oil Company would shorten itself to Conoco. The Atlantic Refining Company would merge with the Richfield Oil Corporation in 1966 to form ARCO. The South Penn Oil Company would survive into the present as Pennzoil. The smaller daughters were absorbed by stages into the larger ones, until the structure of the trade in the second half of the 20th century had assumed a recognizable shape. The shape was a familiar one. In the closing decade of the 20th century and the opening decade of the 21st, the long arc of the post-dissolution petroleum industry executed a series of mergers that were, in the literal corporate sense, a partial reconstitution of the original combination. British Petroleum acquired Amoco in 1998 in a transaction valued at $48 billion and acquired ARCO the following year. Exxon acquired Mobil in November of 1999 in a transaction valued at $81 billion and approved without significant antitrust opposition by the Federal Trade Commission. Chevron acquired Texaco in 2001. ConocoPhillips was formed by the merger of Continental Oil and Phillips Petroleum in 2002. By the close of 2005, roughly half of the 34 daughter corporations of the 1911 dissolution had been reconsolidated into 4 supermajors, 3 of which carried in their corporate genealogies the direct lineal descent from the original trust. The Federal Trade Commission, in approving the Exxon-Mobil merger in 1999, required the divestiture of approximately 1,500 service stations to address particular regional concentrations. It did not interpose any objection to the underlying combination of the 2 largest direct corporate descendants of the Standard Oil Company. The thoroughness of the original monopoly had been broken in the autumn of 1911 by judicial decree. The capacity of the underlying business to reconstitute itself, in altered form and under different competitive disciplines, had not been broken. The country had built, in the long century after the dissolution, a regulatory apparatus that addressed the most particular abuses by which the trust had been assembled, the railroad rebates, and the cipher books and the secret combinations. It had not built a regulatory apparatus that would prevent the corporations descended from the trust from achieving, by lawful merger and the consolidations of capital markets, a concentration approaching, in certain measures of refining capacity and global reach, the concentration that the trust had originally held. The man who had built the original combination did not, in the years remaining to him after the 1911 dissolution, return to the active management of any commercial enterprise. He had withdrawn from operations a decade and a half earlier. He withdrew, in the years after the breakup, into a kind of public stillness that he would maintain for the remainder of his life, which would prove to be longer than the life of any of his commercial rivals. He gave away, across the closing 26 years of his life, sums of money that no private American had previously possessed, and that the federal income tax, when it was at last enacted in 1913, was not designed to anticipate. The University of Chicago, founded in 1890 with an initial Rockefeller gift of $600,000, received from him in total, by the time of his death, more than $35 million, the largest single private gift to a university in the history of higher education to that date. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, founded in 1901, became the leading center for biomedical research in the United States and produced, by the close of the 20th century, 26 Nobel laureates. The General Education Board, founded in 1903, distributed across its half-century of operations more than $300 million to the American educational system, with a particular emphasis upon the formerly segregated schools of the American South. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913 with an initial endowment of $100 million, undertook the systematic eradication of hookworm in the American South in the years before the First World War, a campaign that touched some 600,000 children. The Foundation's International Health Division extended that work, after 1914, to the eradication of yellow fever in Central America, the West Indies, and West Africa, and supported the laboratory research of Max Theiler that produced the yellow fever vaccine in 1937, for which Theiler received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1951. Spelman Seminary, the school for the daughters of freed slaves in Atlanta, founded in 1881 and renamed Spelman College in 1884 after Rockefeller's wife, Laura Spelman Rockefeller, became one of the foremost institutions of higher education for African American women in the United States. The Tuskegee Institute received, across the years of Booker T. Washington's presidency, sustained Rockefeller support. The colonial Williamsburg restoration, which began under John D. Rockefeller, Jr.'s personal sponsorship in 1926, recovered the 18th-century Virginia capital from the long encroachments of 19th-century alterations and made of it the most extensive museum of early American urban life in the country. These were the works that the Rockefeller fortune accomplished. They are real. They are, in the assessment of historians who have weighed them seriously across the intervening century, of a magnitude that no honest reckoning of John Davison Rockefeller's life can pass over. What the historians have also said, and what the documentary record requires saying, is that the same fortune that built these works was the fortune that had been assembled by the methods documented in the Hepburn testimony of 1879 and in Tarbell's 1904 serial and in Frank Kellogg's 12,000 pages of trial transcript at St. Louis, and that the working men and women whose labor had produced the kerosene and the steel rails and the coal had carried the cost of those methods upon their lives. The pit beneath the burning tent at Ludlow stood at one end of the ledger. Spelman College stood at the other. the same name appears upon both. It is not the office of a documentary to balance the entries, it is the office of a documentary to set them down. John Davison Rockefeller died at his winter home, The Casements, at Ormond Beach in eastern Florida, on the morning of the 23rd of May, 1937. He was 2 months short of his 98th birthday. He had outlived his wife by 22 years. He had outlived all but 2 of his original 8 Standard Oil partners. He had outlived the Roosevelt who had ordered the federal case against him, the Sherman whose statute had brought him to court, the Tarbell whose serial had set the country against him, and a long succession of presidents, attorneys general, prosecutors, and judges who had taken up in their day the question of what was to be done with the empire he had built. His funeral was held at the Pocantico estate. His body was returned to Cleveland for burial in the Lakeview Cemetery, beside the wife and the family of his early years. He had become, by the time of his death, a figure who belonged in no obvious sense to any one century. He had been born into the country of Andrew Jackson and the kerosene lamp. He had died into the country of Franklin Roosevelt and the federal income tax and the radio. The empire he had built had been broken in form in the spring of 1911, on the day the Chief Justice had read the opinion in the marble chamber. The empire had not, in the substance that mattered to the country in the long century after, ever fully ended. Its corporate descendants had reconstituted themselves into a smaller number of larger corporations. Its philanthropic descendants had funded the institutions that healed and educated tens of millions of human beings. Its labor legacy had passed into the structure of American industrial relations through the Mackenzie-King Company Union Plan that began at Colorado Fuel and Iron, and through the broader 20th century reckoning with the conditions that the Walsh Commission had documented. Its political legacy had passed into the federal antitrust law in the form of the rule of reason, which White had introduced in the very opinion that ordered the trust dismantled, and which has governed the construction of the Sherman Act every year since. Its long shadow lay across the American century and lies across it still. In the front parlor of a small house in Titusville, Pennsylvania, where Ida Tarbell's father had once read his copy of the Cleveland Leader and gone in his 50s back to the carpenter's trade. A granddaughter of one of the producers, ruined in 1872, could, 100 years later, draw a glass of water at her kitchen tap and watch the tap deliver, by the workings of a public utility that her grandfather had not lived to see. The water that the Allegheny watershed had once delivered through the wooden tanks his small hands had built. She could fill a kettle. She could light a stove with a turn of a knob in a kitchen lit, in any season, by the labor of generations of men and women whom no documentary has ever identified by name. She could read, if she chose, the book the Tarbell daughter had written. She could read it in any of the 47 languages into which it has, since 1904, been translated. The country was, by the early 21st century, no longer organized around the kerosene lamp. It was organized around the gasoline engine, the electrical grid, and the network of pipelines and tankers that the Standard Oil daughters had spent the 20th century building. Whether that organization was the achievement that the founders of the Trust had imagined when they signed the trust agreement at 44 Broadway in 1882, or whether it was something darker than they had imagined, or larger, or simply different, is a question that the country has not, in the century since the dissolution, finally answered. The empire had ended in the formal sense the law required. The empire had not, in any meaningful sense, ever ended. The shadow remained. The shadow remains. You have been watching Empire of Acres. Thank you for spending this hour with us. The story of the American Republic and the great fortunes built upon its land and its labor is a story still in the telling, and the channel will return in time to the men and women and the places by whom it has been shaped. If the telling has been of value to you, the work continues with your support, and we are grateful for it.